All right, welcome back to the General Transit Workshop. In this video, we're going to be discussing our first objective, which is how to read a system map and a route map. So let's first discuss system maps, right? So a system map is kind of like an overview. It's an overview of all of the transit service within a confined area. Sometimes a transit agency will publish multiple system maps if that area, if their kind of total served area is very large. But for a smaller agency, it might just be one kind of very small system map. When we're looking at system maps, in order to derive information from them, we want to take note of a few of their aspects. They're listed below. So first is the legend, right? So the legend tells us how do we interpret the map or actually derive information from it in the first place. What do the symbols that appear on the map actually mean? Once we understand the contents of the legend, we have a baseline. It tells us the method to interpret the map even before we can go investigating into the content of the map itself. When we're looking at a legend, we also want to note how the symbols on the legend are applied kind of in real life on the map. And this is because the map tends to be a lot more complex. And so the symbols might be a little bit more confused on the map compared to on the legend. And also if we can review and kind of practice what they look like on the map, we don't have to refer to the legend as much. Next, we want to look at the routes. So of course, routes form the transit agency, right? And so we're not necessarily using a system map as a means to investigate every single individual route, but it's more like a tool for us to gauge the level of transit service in our area, right? So we want to know how many routes are there? Are there few routes? Are there many routes? What places do they connect? So residences, businesses, neighborhoods, cities. What roads or pathways do they take? Where are they dense or sparse? Meaning, are the kind of pathways for the routes very close together, or are they kind of far apart, right? And kind of, as I mentioned before, right? If we can understand or kind of have some general answers to these questions, we understand the quality of this transit service in an area. So we can actually understand, in other words, how easy is it to access transit service? And when we're looking for the routes, it might also be helpful to use the inset maps. So those are kind of those zoomed in maps that may appear on system maps to understand, especially if there's a region where a lot of routes converge. It might be helpful to understand kind of these specific pathways that they take within that kind of high density, high concentration area. We also want to look for the transit hubs. So what is a transit hub, first of all? A transit hub is a specific location. So it could be a transit center, a park and ride, a train station, or any kind of other specific point, right? A specific location where a lot of routes congregate. And so the point of a transit hub is to allow for quick transfers between routes. So when we're investigating transit hubs, we want to know, of course, where are the transit hubs, right? Usually they'll have on the legend a symbol or a group of symbols that will kind of denote the transit hubs. We also want to know what transit hubs or regions, geographical regions, do the routes for just one particular transit hub serve. In other words, if we're at transit hub A, can we go to transit hub B or C or D or E, right? How many connections can we make to different places or different transit hubs is kind of what we're after. And by investigating this, we serve kind of a practical purpose, right? Because when we take transit, often we need to transfer. And so if we can understand where to transfer, which is primarily at these transit hubs, it's very crucial to our navigation within transit. Fourth, corridors. So a corridor is basically a road where at least one route makes a significant amount of stops with little to no deviation. So you can think of it as kind of, you have point A, point B, it just kind of stays on that road without going anywhere else. Often these corridors will be major city roads or arterials, if you're familiar with that term, or highways. But they, of course, don't have to, right? So on a system map, you can't guarantee that something might be a corridor, but you can kind of just look for long stretches of road, right? That's mostly accurate where to determine where the corridors actually are. And even if you're not correct, you kind of have a improved understanding of the specific pathways of the routes, right? And it's also, if we know kind of what corridors transit serves in general, we can understand the places we can go, right? Places along which routes, or places closest to which routes. We want to be able to know that to determine the kind of range of destinations we have. Lastly, landmarks. So a landmark is just a point of interest. Could be a grocery store, a mall, a government building, a school, etc. Right? System maps, of course, don't include all landmarks, but usually a few major ones are listed. And routes and transit routes are actually designed around these landmarks. So we can actually, just by looking at these landmarks, kind of understand some more of the final destinations, right? Specific final destinations we can access through transit. So now let's kind of do an example to visualize all this. So this is the system map for Link Transit, which is in Chelan and Douglas counties in Washington. And so let's kind of go through all those points, right? So first we have the legend in that kind of right-hand side. This legend doesn't really tell us very much. It just tells us what colors each route correspond to. There's not very much in this legend, but it might be helpful to just kind of see how they map out on the actual system map nonetheless. And if you need to, you can kind of always return to the slide to see the full map, but we're going to kind of zoom into specific areas of it. So here are our two kind of screenshots. So let's first look at the image to the left. Here we're able to visualize routes, right? We see the route 1 and the route 24. We see their pathways. We see how dense they are, right? We see how close together those lines are. We also might want to take note that certain symbols that appear in the system map don't actually appear in the legend, right? And this is what we were talking about when we were talking about there's more complexity in the map, right? If you notice the kind of direction marker, right? The kind of square and then the triangle on top or the triangle bottom. So that's what we will refer to as the direction marker. So the direction marker on the 1 and the 24, the symbol doesn't appear on the legend, right? But we can kind of infer that this is kind of talking about direction. We can infer it's talking about direction. For example, right, for the direction marker of the 1, it kind of tells us that the 1 only takes the kind of left pathway when it is going quote, quote, up, right? Whereas the 24 might take that kind of black pathway when it's going both, quote, up and down, right? If we see a symbol we don't kind of understand, we definitely want to try to understand it. But if we can't just understand it by looking at the system map, it might be helpful to do some sort of research. for example, by looking at the specific route maps to understand the actual meaning of the symbol. But now let's take a look at the right-hand picture, right? Here we have an example of a transit hub, right? We see a bunch of routes congregate at Wenatchee Valley Mall. Wenatchee Valley Mall is probably also a landmark as a mall, right? And we also see a corridor, right? Valley Mall Parkway, where a lot of transit routes kind of run continuously, but also, right, we can yeah, a lot of routes run continuously on Valley Mall Parkway. So these are, we've seen all of the elements of a system map in this particular system map, right? Okay. So now let's examine route maps. Route maps are definitely similar to system maps, but they, of course, detail a specific route. So we have a lot of similarities, but we'll have to note some differences. So definitely we begin with the legend, right? Reading the legend helps us understand what the map is trying to convey. It might, because the map might include specialized information, right? On this particular map, on the right-hand side, which is for a TriMet, which is in Portland route. If you look at the legend on the kind of bottom left, we see the meaning of 3 different symbols, right? We see route schedule stop. We'll kind of discuss all of these, but route schedule stop, transfer nearby, and max line and station, right? So we kind of have an idea of what some of the symbols mean right now. So next thing we want to discuss is terminals. So a terminal is the first stop or the last stop of a transit route, right? The importance of terminals is understanding the distance a route travels and the places that are connected. For example, in this particular map, one of the terminals is Sylvie Island, right, to the north or the kind of upper portion of this image. But there are definitely some exceptions to terminals. The 2 primary ones come in the form of linked routes, where instead of stopping and kind of having a last stop, a route just kind of continues on as another route. So in essence, the last stop is the first stop of another route, and there's no kind of waiting in between. Here we just kind of define a arbitrary stop as the terminal. Yeah, and with loop routes, that's kind of what we see in the bottom half of this image, right? So we see kind of this rectangular formation, which looks kind of like a loop. And that's where the transit vehicle, turns around instead of having a set final stop. And again, similar to with linked routes, we just kind of arbitrarily define the end of the route, right? On this particular map, the arbitrary kind of last stop is 6th and Oak, and though that's kind of the terminal, right? Transfer points. So we also want to understand where we can transfer to other buses or trains or transit options, right? And so that will be sometimes indicated on the route map, right? Transit trips take at least 1 transfer usually, so we need to understand where we can actually make those transfers. If we look at the legend again, right, we see the label of transfer nearby. And so that kind of tells us that we can transfer, for example, to the 15 at 44th and Yeon. If you look in the kind of center of the map, or maybe the 75 or the 11 or the 44, right? So you see a bunch of different possible transfers that we can make. Next, we will kind of return to the idea of corridors, right? Corridors, just kind of those long stretches of road that without much kind of deviation from that road. here we want to understand corridors for the additional purpose of creating a rough mental map of the route's whole pathway, right? Of course, there will be certain breaks in our understanding, but if we can kind of draw a rough mental picture by knowing the kind of long stretches of road, we can kind of begin to understand the route in a little bit more depth, right? A note about trains. This kind of idea of corridors might not necessarily be relevant for trains because they don't operate on roadways particularly. And so it might be more helpful to understand the kind of stops they make and the order of the stops they make instead of specific corridors. But on this particular map, right, we see some long stretches of road. For example, St. Helens Road, Nato Parkway, Lombard, and Ivanhoe, right? So you can just find those on the map. And lastly, landmarks. So landmarks similar to what we've discussed before. A landmark could be any extra information that we see just from the route map, neighborhoods, cities, not necessarily just individual buildings. On this particular map, we see a bunch of connections to different neighborhoods. For example, Portland City Center, Forest Park, Linton Cathedral Park, etc. And one other, I suppose, note that we want to make is about that kind of max line and station legend kind of item, right? So if you're not familiar, max is kind of their train system, rail system, light rail system. And so we can also, when we were talking about transfer points, right? We can also notice that we can make a transfer to the max, which is the rail again, at First and Oak, right? So we see a bunch of different transfers that we can make. All right, so that should be the end of this first objective. And I hope you come back for the next video. Thank you.